Can you explain the history and background of the Black Hebrew Israelite movement and ideology? What would be an adherent status in Halacha?
What would be the black what? Yeah.
Black Hebrew Israelite.
Oh, the Black Hebrews? No, forget it.
It's funny, this is the question I was.
It's a great question. I like it.
Probably my bride would do a good job with that.
Yeah.
Probably my wife would do a good job with that also. It's not my cup of tea. Good. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
I know this is a larger topic, but could you sketch out a bit of Adam and Hava's mistakes that led to the fall? Not just the mistakes, the errors themselves, but maybe some of the causes behind it.
Look, the second chapter of the guide is where the Rambam talks about this. Now, there are many, many different commentaries and analyses and so forth and so on. So I've only invested in one or two. I know Rav Dessler has an essay on the subject, which I often teach, and that's certainly recorded. It's probably easier than doing the Rambam. No, the Rambam's, do I have it recorded in some place? Probably not. Anyway, Rav Dessler has a very interesting analysis based on many different sources, which I'm not going to go into in detail. So, they were created in a condition where they couldn't deliberately disobey. They could not deliberately disobey. They weren't capable of that. But they were capable of disobeying if they thought they weren't disobeying. And then, in reasoning about what God really wants, they were subject to the temptation to rationalize. So, God said, don't eat from the tree. Here was their thought, and by the way, the Rambam credits this thought to both Adam and Chava, not just Chava. And so does the Ramchal. We are only capable of deliberately obeying God. So how much is our obedience worth? What's the alternative? Wouldn't it be better if we would eat from the tree, make ourselves capable of deliberately disobeying, and then obey? Wouldn't that be a much greater sanctification of God's name in the world if we fought down a much greater temptation? That's step one. Of course, step two is, don't be stupid. God said not to eat from it, right? So, take your thoughts and trash them. Oh, but it's not so simple. Because Jewish law allows deliberate disobedience of one of God's laws if it will lead to a greater sanctification of God's name. That's called a hashgafic. That's a meta rule that's built into the system. So their thought was, we'll violate God's law once on the grounds that will lead to a condition of a greater sanctification of God's name, and then we will conquer the temptation and bring that greater sanctification into existence. That was their thought. Now you'll say, well, so what's wrong with that? I mean, you just spelled out the logic where it seems to be quite accurate. Yeah, it's quite accurate, but it's based on a premise, and this is where the fault was. They portrayed their motivation to themselves as, I'll have to call you back, I'm giving a shear. I hope I turned it off. Yeah. They portrayed their motivation to themselves as, when we eat from the tree, we will create a much greater sanctification of God's name. If we don't, there won't be any significant sanctification of God's name. That's the way they portrayed their motivation to themselves. It wasn't accurate. The real motivation is, if we don't eat from the tree, and we merely do what we're programmed to do, then we will be trivial. We will be insignificant. We will be meaningless. We will have no value. We will have no standing. Really, they were worried about their own insignificance, their own triviality. But they twisted it in their minds into God's service will be trivial, not we will be trivial. And that was the temptation. The temptation was to see clearly into their own motivation and realize that what was moving them was not a care for the triviality of God's project, but a care for the triviality of their part in God's project. That's where the failure was. That's where the rationalization took place, and that's where the failure was. So now the Bali Musar have this principle of analyzing your own motivation. It's a crucial element in the ultimate service of God. It fits into their philosophical framework. So that's the way he explains it. That's one way to explain it. That you can read in English in the Strive for Truth series, where he has weekly essays on the parshas and brachas. That's what he says.
What's his last name once again?
Sorry, Dessler.
Dessler.
Just like a very quick follow-up. So arrogance did kind of play a part, but subconsciously, so appropriating more to themselves than was fitting.
You might say that. You might say it.
And this also kind of reminds me of problems we consider with AI, where an AI has a goal of making paper clips, right? And so what it does is it consumes all of civilization in order to make it all a paperclip farm. So it has this kind of sub-goal, and so it's...
Okay, don't start me on AI.
Okay.
Why not?
AI has no goals, it has no thoughts, it has no understanding, it has no logic, it has no principles. AI recognizes shapes. That's all it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and for issues in which there's a lot of hashgafic disagreement on certain things, how do you discern a methodology in which you hold to the concepts that you hold to? If you pick at all.
How do you make decisions about issues in deep Jewish philosophy? How do you make decisions? How do you make decisions about surgery? How do you make decisions about supply side economics? How do you make decisions about world trade? Well, you lean on people who know the expertise. You don't make them yourself. That's dumb. That's irrational, right? You don't make decisions on surgery. If you're not a trained surgeon, you're not qualified to have an opinion. Yeah, you heard me right. In America, the slogan is not everyone has a right to an opinion. The slogan is everyone has an obligation to have an opinion. What do you mean you don't have an opinion? What do you think? And if you claim that this is beyond me and I'm not qualified to make an evaluation, you're somehow not a party to the discussion. You're politically incompetent. I think you're just rational. But so it's not a question of my having a methodology. When I was teaching at university, I would teach the Bohr-Einstein debates in quantum mechanics. And the students would always ask, who's right? And I'd say, who are you asking? Me, who's right between Bohr and Einstein? I'm happy I can enrich my understanding of the world a little bit by knowing something about the debate. I can tell you who the contemporary greatest physicists think is right. They divided, but I can tell you who they think is right. Well, why should I have an opinion on the subject? It's incompetent and irresponsible to have an opinion on a subject that you haven't mastered. Who you have an opinion? It's ridiculous. And in no practical area of life would you do that. You would not undertake medically servicing your own child. Your own child is too precious to you for you to make medical decisions for him. What's your opinion about what surgery your child needs? Idiotic.
Are there times in which the criteria, you're able to weigh criteria of individuals who hold opinions to see and decide with one or the other? If
you're talking about individuals who are on a par with me or below me in terms of their education and their experience and their understanding, sure. But not people who are vastly above me.
So anyone during the Rishonim period you would be completely...
For sure.
Even if their opinions, like the Rambam would disagree with this one individual on this, you can't side with the Rambam over another figure on a certain hashgafic issue?
Certainly not. That would be like saying, deciding for yourself which one of the greatest decisions of the Supreme Court in the 19th century you're going to follow. But it's the 21st century. You can't use 19th century decisions to follow. What you want to know is what your sages today say about what the Rambam and the Ramban and the Rosh and the Ben Yon and all the rest of them say. Not what they say. You can't skip out 800 years of history. That's like the Gemara. I've raised this question before, but the message hasn't gotten across. You have a contradiction between Maimonides and the Talmud. Who wins?
Both of them?
No, the contradiction, at least on the surface. Maimonides wins because he knew that Talmud and he took this position anyway. So either you're misinterpreting what the Talmud said, or there's another statement elsewhere in the Talmud, and it disagrees with this statement in the Talmud, and Maimonides held like that statement rather than this statement. Or maybe your logic is wrong, that there really isn't a contradiction. But you don't You always go with the latest authority. The Talmud itself says that. You go with the latest authority. Because he takes into account the previous authorities. So if he has a different opinion, there's some reason why he chose to decide the way he does.
There's also, just to clarify, is there a difference in cases where, for halacha, where there's a certain ruling we hold to, and then in case of hashgafic, we wouldn't choose with specific, I guess we would have rulings rather.
We have rulings in hashgafa, we definitely do, and the same methodology is used. Rabbi Meisman has this in his book, in a whole chapter, or someone who had a big reputation once said that roughly in hashgafic issues, there's no rulings, and it's all a free play, and everybody takes his own opinion, and there's no such thing as settling things, and it's just dead wrong. This poor person based himself on 3 statements that you find Maimonides' writings in Arabic, which have to be translated, and which he read to mean these are issues that you don't decide. What he didn't take into account is that 2 out of the 3, the Rambam himself decides in the Mishnah Torah in Hebrew. He decides them himself. So it couldn't be that he's saying, in principle, they can't be decided when he himself decides them. I think that probably is right. So,
in which book, Torah Hazal and Science, by Meisman?
Yeah, Torah Hazal and Science. Yeah, he has a whole chapter on that. Yeah.
I have a question about language, Raf. So, I started thinking recently about the languages which are held among the Jews. So my question could be divided in 2 sections. First, I started thinking, at what point lashon Hakodesh stopped being official language among the Jews in the history among in the King's era, right? King Solomon, etc. At what point it stopped being, and what language actually our sages and the big Chachamim advise to be held among the Jews, Aramaic or Yiddish, whatever. So what is really recommended among them to be used by the Jews, and also since perhaps they have recommendations, our modern day Gottleib perhaps also would have wanted the Jews in Aretz, yes, to speak specific language, perhaps Yiddish, whatever, what perhaps they have recommendations.
It's a very complex question, and I can only offer a couple of comments. I don't know the material that well. There was a gradual shift from Hebrew to Aramaic. Mm-hmm. Here's a question you should think about. I should ask other people about. I have found that almost no one has paid any attention to it. In what language is the Kaddish prayer?
Mm-hmm. Aramaic.
Really? Yis Gadal v'Yis Kadash is Aramaic?
It's Hebrew.
Gadal is Hebrew.
Hebrew.
In Hebrew, in Aramaic, it would be Rabbah,
Yeah.
right? Kadash, right? The truth is, it's a mixture. It's a mixture of both languages. It's a kind of patois. I discovered that about 8 years ago. I was thinking about it. Sometimes when I think about it, I get ideas. So I started asking people. Most people hadn't even noticed it. And then I surmised, and I asked people, and they thought it was a reasonably good guess, that this prayer must have been composed at a time when people spoke a patois of the 2 languages. They were using both languages. It was a kind of mixture of the 2 languages. That's what was familiar to them at that time. So there was a gradual breakdown. So that when you get to even the time of the Mishnah, I think the majority of the population spoke Aramaic. Mishnah is the language of the law, which they. And the reason why the Talmud is in Aramaic, because the vast majority of it is actual conversations that took place. Not because it was composed as a text. Most of it is conversations, discussions, and debates about halakhic issues or other issues. And it was the discussion was conducted in Aramaic. So definitely there was a shift of that kind. Now there is definitely in halakhic sources some superiority to speaking Hebrew, starting to teach your child Hebrew. That obviously fell very largely out of practice. What would they say today? You see, a language isn't just a means of communication. A language embodies a culture. There's a whole literature on Yiddish curses. You should grow like an onion with your head in the ground. Little things like that. So if you shift a language, you're also shifting your culture. And that needs careful thought as to exactly how it should be done. Yiddish embodies a certain culture of European Jewry for 1,000 years. And that's why in some places they still give the official classes in Yiddish to the highest students. because they don't want to lose that culture. It's not a question of the words, the sounds, and the tune. It's a question of the embodiment of a culture. I couldn't begin to make a decision about something or comment what the contemporary authorities would want to say about that. That's all I can really say about that.
There is no single opinion, Rav, you mean?
I'm sorry? What?
There is no single opinion among the that Israel.
There may be, I just
There
don't
might
know.
be, sorry.
I'm
Okay.
confessing my
Very
ignorance
much.
of it. I say, yeah.
So we learn in the text in the Nach, right, that Shaul is a king that was appointed even though that he wasn't from the tribe of Yehudah. So my question is, could we expect or like, is it necessarily the Mashiach gonna be from the line of David, or is there a source or a way that perhaps we could maybe find that it could be, I don't know, from Binyamin or like.
The answer is no. There's no other possibility. And Shaul was appointed as an interim king. He was appointed only to establish a framework into which the representative of the tribe of Judah could step. And this is why some say that his failure cost him, because he was appointed to be a leader, and when David took over, he could have been a leader under David, maybe given a province to be in charge of, or some other kind of leadership role, but there was no thought of his being representative of the kingdom of Israel. And in fact, if you look at it carefully, there's a verse in the book of Shmuel over there, which if you read it carefully, sort of indicates this in bold terms. Because in the Haftarah, where it says that God took away the status from Shaul and gave it to David, Shmuel comes to Shaul and he says, you're supposed to kill out the Amalekites and you didn't, and I hear the animals, and Shaul makes excuses, and then Shmuel says God hasn't accepted your excuses, and he decided he doesn't want you as king, and Shmuel turns to walk away, and Shaul grabs his cloak, and the cloak rips. And Shmuel says to Shaul, just as you've ripped the cloak, God has ripped the kingdom away from you this day. Now, when maybe I should try to find the text quickly. This is in
Shmuel Bey, Shmuel Aleph?
Yeah, it's in the Haftarah. It's in the Haftarah for. I won't even be able to find. We just had it. Yeah. Because he uses the same word twice. Once positively, once negatively. Where was it?
The double usage implies that even his line can't inherit the kingship?
No. Don't guess. This is Dvorah. I never remember where he's talking about. Oh, Amalek. Maybe it's. Shalach? It isn't here. No. Anyway, what he says is this. He says to show God has rejected you. Nicham. He was nicham on you being king. Then he says, it's been given to somebody else better than you. And don't think you can change it. Don't think you can undo it, because lo ish kel vinachem. God is not like a man to be linachem. But just 10 sentences before, you said he was nachem. And now you say he's not nachem. What do you mean? If he doesn't, he doesn't. So the answer is that linachem means to reject a certain proposition from now on. Some times they translate it as regret. That's a terrible mistake. God doesn't make mistakes, so he has to regret. But something was going on, a certain process. And now God says, from here on, a different process. Now, sometimes God will do that and sometimes not. And the simple distinction is, if this process represents a goal of the world's existence, a purpose for which the world was created, then it's not going to change. But if this process is a means to achieve something else, it isn't a goal in and of itself, it's a means to achieve something else. It could be that using this means was appropriate up until now, and now, from here on, a different means will be used to achieve that goal. Shaul's control was a means to an end. David's kingship is the end. It's not a means to an end. So God says to Shaul, God was menachem. He gave up you as a means, and now is shifting it away from you. But David isn't the means; he's the end. And that God doesn't change the strategy, because that's the goal. So when you understand the difference between them, then you understand that what the difference is between someone like Shaul. So David is the. That's why, to answer your question directly, you probably know this. What happened when the Maccabees became kings? The Maccabees were Kohanim. That was wrong. They shouldn't have done that. They should have taken some descendant of Yehuda, and preferably even a descendant of David. And in fact, don't think it doesn't say that all the kings will be descendants of David. The Mashiach will be a descendant of David. But all the kings have to come from Yehuda. That was a terrible mistake. Yeah. Well, who's next? Yeah.
So, how would you respond to people who would claim that the 13 principles of faith seem to be this type of some type of dogma? This almost.
How would I respond to people who say the 13 principles of faith? I would say, congratulations, you got it exactly right. Oh, I hear the deeply, deeply embedded prejudices of the Reformed Jewish world with which I grew up and was trained in, and the secular world and the rest of it. Oh, God forbid you should have some dogma. Doesn't it sound like Christianity? Listen, let me clue you in. We are not anti-Christians. We're Jews. Christians might get something right. All right, it's not in our blood that we should disagree with everything the Christians do. We have our position, and you look at it objectively and say, if they agree with certain things, then what they're doing is right. If not, we have to disagree with them. We definitely have requirements for belief. Lots of them. The 13 are only, in a certain sense, the most central and most serious. Some who objected to Maimonides 13 to say, if you think that this word was written by Moses and not by God, you failed in your belief. This word, or this particular law was, that isn't one of the 13. But still, there are things that you're prescribed to believe. Were Jews slaves in Egypt? I think they were in Assyria. Sorry, that's not open to you to think. You're obligated to believe what the Torah tells you, because what the Torah tells you is what God tells you is true. So you're obligated to believe that. We have lots of obligations of belief. Indeed, I think it's sort of weird for someone to say that there are no obligations of belief. Hare, the significance of what you do is based on your beliefs. Surely, your actions can't be virtuous if you are convinced that by these actions you will get a personal profit, and were there not to be a personal profit, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't call them virtuous. The very same action can be selfish, self-serving, and base and corrupt, or can be the highest virtue, depending upon the beliefs that you have that go behind it. A human being's beliefs are far more central to his identity than the motions of his body. Imagine pulling a trigger and killing someone. Believing it's self-defense is entirely, or even better, believing it's defending somebody else is going to get killed. Or the world's not big enough for him and me, and he's going to leave. And pulling the trigger. The beliefs make all the difference between the actions. Beliefs aren't something trivial or something to be discarded. That was a dogma of the Reform movement, and it was so philosophically and psychologically superficial. And we would celebrate it. We accept it as dogma, and we're happy to have it as dogma, and it's an integral part of Jewish living.
Is there any valid room to challenge any one of those principles? Not as individually, but I mean.
You could challenge anything. It may be formulated incorrectly. The Rambam held that if someone thinks that God is a physical body, then he's a heretic, so to speak. The Rabbi said absolutely not. Of course, God isn't a physical body. I'm not questioning that. And you should believe that he is, but he's not a heretic. And he penned the bitter words, Gdolim mimenu, said, people greater now, mimenu in Hebrew is ambiguous. I said this in the previous hour. Mimenu can mean greater than we, or it can make greater than he. Ha! What did the Rabbi mean when he said, those are greater than, believed that God was a body? Do you mean greater than all of us, or greater than just you? And the word is ambiguous in Hebrew. Right? So here's a disagreement as to whether this wrong belief counts as heresy or doesn't count as heresy. Of course, things are open to discussion. When I started down this road, my Rabbi said to me, just remember that just like there can be a disagreement about whether or not a chicken is kosher, there can also be a disagreement about who's a heretic, and there can be a disagreement about what's proper belief, what's improper belief. Everything is open for discussion and analysis and thought and challenge. Everything's open. Of course, if you've been in the system 3 months and you have some ideas, it might not be wise to challenge 3,000 years of thoughtful Jewish history, but nothing's beyond challenge. So, we make a difference of belief or not. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, so Ralph, I have a question. So, philosophical one. Recently, I've read very interesting news that even Chinese government sent a special space shuttle to space to try to discover some lives on other systems and planets. So we as Jews, right, are we allowed to take any part in the process of searching for the life, if there can be possible, right? And do we actually even have opportunity to think and to suppose that there might be other life forms in the galaxy?
Well, as far as I know from Jewish sources, there's no prejudice whatsoever as to whether there be life forms in the galaxy. Why would the galaxy be, or the universe be, any different from the seafloor? The seafloor is not a place where people go, and they don't go in special contraptions. Nobody wants to go there, and there are things living there. Or not living there, but there happen to be things living there, so what? We don't have any prejudice about that. We have no prejudice as to what God did in other places in the universe. We don't even have prejudice as to whether or not there would be intelligent life there. Mm-hmm. I think the real question is whether there's any intelligent life here. Okay, that was a joke. Okay. And if the porpoises are clicking away, porpoise Shakespeare, and if the chimpanzees are solving differential equations in their grunts and whines and wheezes, it wouldn't bother us.
Why?
Why should it? Nothing in our Torah requires us to believe that we're more intelligent than they are. We are chosen. We have a soul that can make moral decisions. And we can understand the significance of moral decisions. We can understand what it means to relate to God, and so on. That will be unique. Mm-hmm. But mere intelligence, as I said before, don't try AI on me. I know too much about it. But that's not something which, and indeed, the angels are credited by many as having, at least as the human beings exist in this world, much superior intelligence, much superior understanding of God. And of course, they don't have the tendency to do evil, so we don't have to be superior in that respect either. There are certain certain qualities of soul and certain qualities of free will and spirituality. Those are things. But intelligence, I don't think we have any prejudice whatsoever.
But what if we find in the galaxy humanoid lives, basically perhaps even more advanced forms of life, more humanoid, advanced, or even more races, whatever, species, which would be superior to us even in terms of thinking, whatever. What if we do find it?
Well, I guess the question will be, what does superior mean? You have about 86 billion neurons in your head. Now, let's suppose they have 400 billion neurons in their head. So if we have to multiply in our heads 2 50-digit numbers, we're going to find that hard, right? But they can do 600 digits, right? So what? We wouldn't be bothered by that. So they can multiply 600-digit numbers in their head, so what? The question will be, do they have a finer understanding of morality and spirituality? They have a finer development of self-control and self-mastery and so forth and so on. That, I think, would be problematic, and therefore I don't think we're going to find it.
So indeed we should assume, Raf, that Hashem created specifically on this our earth this particular form of life which does have all these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise...
But you asked about life.
No, okay,
For all that, for that, all you need is the dividing cells, right? And that could be anywhere.
So there will be problem if we do find humanoid.
Yeah, but I'm not worried about it. I'm not worried about it because, again, I know too much. The requirements for finding life altogether in the universe are much, much more difficult to satisfy than you are told in your propagandized New York Times supplement. There was a book written 20 years ago called Rare Earth, and there have been many follow-up studies that they don't tell you about, where life itself will be difficult. And the conditions which they think, lead to intelligent life are even more specialized. So that even if there were 10 to the 22 stars in the universe, the probability of finding it is very, very small. Even with billions of years, it's very, very small. Big numbers don't conquer everything. Yeah.
Thank you.
What's the Jewish view on religious involvement in government?
Religious involvement in government. Well, let's divide the question in half. The picture of the Torah of government and literature and art and war and economics and hygiene and sport is only one: it's serving God. There is no other purpose for anything. Separation of church and state? Come on, you got to be joking. By the way, do a little history of separated church and state in America. You'll find out that it has no foundation at all. One, I think, of Thomas Jefferson's letters mentions it. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in any laws anywhere. He mentioned it, and then about 100 years ago, people began to make a big deal out of it. Anyway, so there's no such thing as anything separate from Torah or anything separate from serving God. The king was subject to the Sanhedrin. The king was subject to the prophets. He wasn't an absolute monarch. He was instituted by a religious procedure. So there's certainly no way of separating that. That's the picture of the way in which all of life runs, including politics. Now you ask, well, what's practical to do today? That's a different story altogether. Because there's certain purposes, certain goals, and certain things that have to be accomplished, and the means by which they're accomplished, and the secondary effects have to be taken into account. The only person who could answer a question like that is someone who has correct command of all the Torah sources and has a correct understanding of how politics actually works and what the difference would be if the politics would shift. I don't know if Netanyahu anticipated this kind of wild, immoral, hypocritical leftist response. I don't think he realized how much Israel has grown to imitate America and imitate the utter corruption of the left in America. I don't know that he anticipated that. Had he anticipated, maybe he would have gone about the judicial reform in a different way. But I, like many people, believe that judicial reform is absolutely necessary. That doesn't mean that this way of going about it was the smartest way of going about it. Maybe it was. I don't know. Maybe my alternatives wouldn't have worked. I'm not an expert in it. But that's the kind of thing you'd have to have in a grasp to be able to answer a question like this. And I certainly can't have an opinion on it. Yes?
Okay, so to the popular topic of the night, for AI, it's been replacing intellectual jobs. So if we try to pursue jobs that reward you for knowledge, what are we supposed to do if we want to pursue those types of jobs? Just not do them at all and go back to physical labor?
Well, I think there are two things here. You speak carefully. You're using your words carefully, and I'm glad to hear that. You say you're replacing jobs for which we have used intelligence. What the real implication is that the kind of job for which we use intelligence can be done without intelligence. That's the right answer. Not that it has intelligence, but it does it in an utterly different way, which gives you the same output. I'll give you a very simple example. I have a machine, I put in two numbers, and it gives me the sum. Big numbers, gives me the sum every time. So you think, oh, of course, there's an addition machine, right? Yeah, but it depends on how it works. There's an algorithm for doing addition. You learned it as a kid, and you can still do it, right? Suppose it's got a lookup table. Just a giant spreadsheet. Number, and at the box in the middle is the answer. And it just looks it up. There's not adding, it's looking up. You could be looking up names and addresses also. Names and addresses and telephone numbers, right? So the same output can be produced by different processes, one of which might imitate thoughtful processing, and the other of which is not thoughtful at all. If you're interested in this subject, I heartily recommend John Searle's favorite argument called the Chinese room argument, which he made 30 years ago. Something, the Chinese room argument by John Searle. And it went through two phases where he gave too much credit. Computers recognize shapes. They recognize physical inputs. And they are programmed to manipulate physical inputs according to certain rules. Take this physical input on the left and take that physical input and put it on the right, and then cut this one in half and stitch them together and then give the output. There's absolutely no understanding there. There's not even an appreciation of the fact that they're symbols. They're just physical inputs and outputs. Like you have a child who's coloring according to the numbers. A random, what to him is a random design, doesn't recognize what it is. So 3, red. 4, yellow. And then he cans it in and goes on to the next thing. So what you're learning is that things that you used intelligence to do can be done without intelligence. If you care about this, take out Chat GPT, like I did, and quiz it on the simplest logic. The simplest logic. Had no clue what it's doing. I have a whole bunch of these, but I asked it, is the sentence, this sentence is true? True. And it gave me back, that's the liar paradox. When a sentence says that it's false, and it can't be true and it can't be false, because if you say it's true, it's got to be false, if it's false, it's got to be true. So I wrote back, look again. I didn't write, this sentence is false. I wrote, this sentence is true. And it gave me back the same answer again. So I wrote it again. You're substituting false for true. I wrote true. So and then it's trained to apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry. Then it says, yeah, it's true because it says it's true. I said, really? Because it says that it's true. It's true. Couldn't be lying. It couldn't be mistaken. What do you mean? This is the kind of nonsense you can get out of it if you don't key into the words that are already programmed in its database. And it has to make a connection with the database. I tried something else. The joke about the guy who was hunting bears. So he left his camp and went 5 miles due south. Then he went 5 miles due west, shot a bear. Then he went 5 miles due north, and by so doing he returned to camp. What color was the bear? Huh? Now think. He went 5 miles due south. Then he went 5 miles due west, shot the bear. Then he went 5 miles due north, and thereby returned to camp. What color was the bear?
It's a joke.
Yeah, what's the right answer?
No.
No, you're mistaken.
Oh, it was red because it's covered with blood.
No. Think! South, west, north! How did he get back to camp?
Ah.
There's 3 sides of a square. Well, there's one point where you can do that. Where's that? The North Pole. Because this way's south, this way's west, and this way's north, and you go back to the North Pole. So the bear was white, right? Ah, okay. That's a famous joke.
None of us got it.
None of you got it, because I won't comment why. Okay, you're not taught to think. Okay, now, here's the quiz question. And I know that he's going to fail in this because I thought of this question, and I didn't publish it. So I know he's not going to have it in his database. Is there anywhere else on the Earth's surface where you could go 5 miles due south, 5 miles due west, 5 miles due north, and thereby return to your point of exit? So he said, of course not. It can't be, because otherwise you're going to end up someplace else. But that's not true. Not only is there a point, there's an uncountable infinity of such points, where you can go 5 miles due south, 5 miles due west, 5 miles due north, and return, and thereby return to this point where you started from. Straight lines.
Straight line.
Yeah, straight lines. Due south is a straight line. Due, right? Okay. Imagine you're at the South Pole. Okay. Now go north and consider a radius around the South Pole as the center, right? Which is exactly 5 miles around. Okay? Now go 5 miles north of that. What will happen if you go 5 miles due south? 5 miles due west means you go all the way round, and then go 5 miles due north, you'll end up back where you were. So the upper line, 5 miles north of the lower line, that whole line, any point of that line is such a thing. So first ChatGPT said, no, there can't be such a thing. And then I said, well, what about this? And I said, no, because then you're going around in a circle. So, yeah, but it's due west, right? Due west takes you around in a circle. And the equator, if you go due west, you go around a circle around the whole globe. So it's a smaller circle. So it could, and then at the end, it came up with that, with some gobbledygook, it stopped making sense altogether. I did the same thing with quantum mechanics, going back in time. Anything you ask which isn't programmed into its database, where it's got to actually come out with a new thing, not by simple analogy, but by the new thing, it's hopeless. There's no intelligence there at all. There's no intelligence there at all.
It's young, it's development. Right?
Yeah. And you can do this yourself, because
Don't grow.
I think it was only trained up until 2021.
Exactly.
And anything that came after 2021, it will have, and even if logic could deliver it, but it hasn't got the logic. It just has stored information, which it compares by the shapes of the words, not because it understands anything, but by the shapes of the words and the families that it's taught that they belong to. So there's no understanding, there's no logic there.
Wait, real quick, can I
Yeah, yeah.
So what if the economy you're in rewards the job that can be done with intelligence that doesn't actually, what you were saying with,
You mean if it goes out of existence because it's replaced by something like this? Well, that will happen. You know, when I was at Hopkins in the 70s, they concocted a curriculum preparing for the multi-career lifetime. Because even then, they anticipated that certain types of careers are going to go out of existence, and a person at the age of 35 or 40 may have to be retrained in order to shift to another area of occupation. So they wanted to give a person a kind of college education which would prepare him for retraining later in life. So this is a problem. But this is no different from training horses to carry buggies when automobiles are invented. You know, those poor horses and the horse trainers sort of lost a lot of business because they weren't using horses anymore. So this has nothing specifically to do with computers or AI. When the economy moves in an innovative society, then the types of work are going to shift, no question about it. You know, when you have machines to do a lot of the work that people used to do, like harvesting. In a farm, instead of having 100 people to pick the crops, you have one machine that picks the crop with one guy. So then picking crops is no longer, not even for migrant workers, is a job, because machines do it faster, cleaner, cheaper, and you know, much more efficiently. Yeah.
He has 2 in a row.
Oh, do I?
I'm not keeping track. You know, you guys have to have. I'll give you slips. You know,
Trade me this.
anybody who hasn't asked who wants to ask? No, I want to fill the time. You have a question?
Yeah, I heard that everybody at some point in their life gets tested with wealth, and depending on what they do with that wealth determines whether or not they're capable of
Tested with
Wealth.
with wealth. Oh no, for sure not. Everybody gets tested with wealth. Hey, just open the history books. The vast majority of people throughout history have been poor, very poor. No, what? How can anybody have dreamt that?
Extreme wealth, which is like having enough money where they can give, let's say like Meister, or just tzedakah in general. On the right way.
Now, that's not a modification of the view. That's giving up the view and said, don't paint it as if I just made a little mistake, between $100, $99. Wealth, I mean, certainly not. And the vast majority of people have lived hand to mouth. I don't know where tomorrow's dinner is coming from. And fasting because I don't have enough food. And certainly not enough clean water. And everybody, I think that's gross exaggeration. Indeed, the Ramchal says that different souls were put into the world to be tested under different conditions, and that's one of the many reasons that you can't say if someone's suffering, he must have failed and God is punishing him. A person can be assigned to deal with the challenges of poverty his whole life, and he'll be poor his whole life, and he can be blameless, entirely blameless. Not all suffering is caused by failure, by religious failure. It's just not true. Yeah.
What is the response to criticisms of a 7-day creation account since a lot of the time people bring up the fact, well, you have the first 2 days didn't have a sun and a moon.
Yeah.
So what's the response to that?
You have a text, and the text uses the same phraseology for 6 days. Evening, morning, the nth day. So clearly the text is treating them all as the same. Okay, not exactly the same. The third day isn't the same as the second day. It comes third, not second. So there obviously are differences. What kind of differences? Well, if you had the same astronomical features, you could say it was the same motions of those astronomical features. Since we know that isn't true, at the very least they weren't in their present places in the sky, so that can't be the common element. The most natural element then is to say that it's the amount of time. 24 hours. So says the Ramban, so implies the Rambam, so do many of the great commentators say. It's a day because it's 24 hours long, which, by the way, I think would be the typical understanding in today's terminology. You imagine if somehow, miraculously, the sun, the moon, the earth stopped rotating on its axis. You could ask, how long did it stop? Because you could look at your watch. You say, well, it was 24 hours and 6 minutes. So you mean it stopped for about a day. Everyone would understand you, and everyone would understand that what you're saying is appropriate.
Is there any opinion to suggest the fact that the first few days were longer than the rest because of this concept?
No, not as far as I know. No. Yeah.
So I don't want to get into like messier problems of free will here. I just want to sketch out like a particular character. It was said earlier today that you can incline towards good and evil. That's what Hashem has sort of given us. I want to sketch out the character of what inclining towards the evil looks like, so we can recognize that in ourselves, so we can catch those kind of mechanisms by which the will is going off track.
Okay, there is a big debate about this in philosophy. I think it's still really between Plato and Aristotle. And sometimes you hear snippets in our sources which sound like one or sound like the other. Plato took the position that to decide to do something, you have to believe that it's good, or at least good for you. The very fact that you decide it implies that that's the way you evaluate it, which means what we would call thorough irrationality is impossible. Of course, you may be wrong that it's good for you. You may be biased and prejudiced in your judgment that it's good for you. But you have to have that conviction, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do it. Aristotle famously disagreed with Plato in that regard. What in Greek is called akrasia, weakness of the will. You can look the thing straight in the face and you can see that it's wrong and do it anyway. I haven't researched, the 400,000 pages of the Jewish tradition, but in my reading, the vast majority do take the position, my position would say that Aristotle reflects the Jewish position rather than Plato respecting. One of the differences between shogeg and mesid, shogeg is where a person does something due to ignorance, either ignorance of the law or ignorance of the circumstances, which means that his motivations are good, but he's doing something that in fact is wrong because of his ignorance. That's as opposed to an avon, which means a deliberate transgression. To tell me that what? He knows that the Torah says not to do it. He knows that God says not to do it, but he really thinks it's good anyway. That's very hard to swallow. He thinks God isn't perfectly good. He thinks God makes mistakes. Well, how is it supposed to work? And I think, from common experience, you see that all the time. Because people do things, forget about good, capital G, and evil, capital E. But what about things that you know are bad for you? Can you do something that you know is bad for you? I think you can. My years in university taught me that a lot of students don't study till the night before the exam. You probably heard about that, right? I mean, you certainly haven't experienced it. And if you ask them, they'll tell you, I know, I only got a B minus, and I could have gotten an A minus if I had studied before that, but that's what I did. And it's that way semester after semester. And the person who believes in Plato has to say, but really deep down, they think this time will be different. Yeah? What makes you think so? Your theory? What evidence do you have? You ask them 3 nights before the exam, where you're sitting there and drinking, shouldn't you be studying? He'll tell you, you're right. I know I should be, I'm just not doing it. He said, no, he's fooling himself. He himself doesn't understand what he really thinks. You have to go into all sorts of contortions to preserve Plato's theory in the light of common experience. Well, those contortions count against the theory because you haven't got evidence that they're true. You're just saving your theory by making up substrata that you don't know exist. People don't go to the dentist and they eat the wrong things and drink the wrong things and sniff the wrong things and inject the wrong things. Right? What about an addict? He's really fooling himself that he's not addicted? Really fooling himself that the addictive substance is not harming him? That's not always true. Not always true. They go for help. They plead for help. They live in terrible, terrible continuous guilt. That's all phony? Because really he thinks it's good for him? I think that the Platonic position is desperate. It may be necessary for certain philosophical commitments, but in practical terms, it's desperate. That's what amazing is. It's amazing. Makir as ribono v'miskamin l'rodbo. There's a category of person who knows God, understands who God is, and has decided to rebel against him. So I think that's going to make it very difficult. In other words, here, it's not a problem of recognizing it. It's a problem what to do when it's staring you in the face, when it's waving the flag. When it's rationalization, like it was in the case of Adam and Chava, so that's a little more deep. That's a little more difficult, and there are certain techniques that can help with that. But if you know that the Yetzer Hara can push you to do brute force against what you know is right, so then it's not a question of identifying it. It's just a question of having strategies to deal with it. Yeah, last question.
Yeah. So speaking of all these topics combined, AI, my topic about new life, I want to summarize just basically in one question. So what's your rough personal opinion on the attempts of humanity, or at least some parts of humanity, to create new life in artificial intelligence or to search for new life in other planets, in other galaxies? What's your personal opinion? Is it going to drive us like Babylonian to the Babylonian Tower branch, or what does it really bring?
A question like that is far beyond my capacity. I think this is the only rational thing to do there is to say that I don't know. But I will say this. There have been a number of great advances in the history of thought, which includes technology and much else as well, where it was based on something which was purely curiosity. where it looked trivial and uninteresting and utopian to think about such a thing, and then very unexpectedly, Leibniz wanted to make a machine that could answer questions, right? And something that could do logic, right? That idea developed over 250 years, 300 years, was the basis for the idea of a computer. So it's very hard to predict what the outcome will be. So I wouldn't say such and such an investigation is worthless or waste of time or violates some pragmatic because it's very difficult to know. I'll give you one example of how this works. They discovered not too long ago how the immune system works, something about it. The immune system has two phases. One phase is to send out antibodies randomly structured. Just send out as wide a variety of things that will attack enemies as you, of course, the vast majority never find any enemies because they're programmed to attack ones of a particular kind and they're not there. But you see, you don't know what the enemy that comes in from the outside is going to look like, do you? Can't really predict. So you send out, and this is very wasteful because the vast majority of them never do any good at all. But when one comes in and gets hit, then the antibody sends back a signal to home base. I got one, and this is what it looks like. And then it starts turning out antibodies like that one to swallow up that new invasion. That's a pretty good system. It's a pretty good system. Searches on the internet are like that also, right? 14,274,000, in 2/3 of a second. Okay, but then you have to decide which ones are relevant. So you get a vast, then you cut it down. So to tell me this kind of investigation, I don't know where it will lead. I don't know what it will give us. I don't know what we'll discover from it. So that being the case, I couldn't say that certain subject is off limits, somehow inappropriate to investigate. If you have to choose between them, so then you look for them. This search for life is motivated by only one thing, to prove that human beings aren't unique. That's the purpose of it. Life is natural, it arises everywhere, and it's all mechanical, and it's all blind, and it's all physical. That's what motivates it, nothing else. Not going to do anything with microbes on Mars, except infect the Earth.